So given that the majority of the world does not have access to therapy, weekly therapy is a luxury for 90% of the world, and therapy at all is a luxury actually for 90% of the world. And we're not going to be able to meet demand within our lifetime. So I wanted to do something that was accessible and that expanded opportunities for people who have a desire to help. But I also recognize that we need to do that ethically and safely, particularly with this population. So that's some of my motivation. We will get into the nuts and bolts of the ethics and how I approach ethics and coaching. I'm a mental health clinician. I've been working with trauma for over 20 years. So I have a really clear picture in my mind how I would like coaches to work alongside me as a therapist and what things I'd like to, what is the word I'm looking for? I guess delegate to someone supporting me as a therapist. But coaching doesn't need to occur alongside therapy per se. But for me as a therapist is very effective and has been really supportive both to me and my clients. So moving into ethics, ethics is knowing the difference between what you have the right to do and what is right to do. I love that quote. And that's how I orient myself towards ethical interactions with survivors and people in general. Please, of course, do not redistribute or sell the contents of this training, of course. So today we'll learn about trauma and its categories. I don't want to assume that everybody here knows the basics of trauma, so I want to address that. I want to describe why trauma coaching is an ethical innovation that can address our current accessibility crisis. Describe how coaching is a form of task shifting, and we'll talk about what task shifting is, and describe Orenda's specific approach to navigating trauma coaching ethically and safely. I did want to announce this really quickly. My clinic is putting on a free 101 training for those who are interested. The link is in the chat. It's designed for everybody, so not just for clinicians or coaches, but also the general public. Another housekeeping thing before I get going. If you don't mind holding your questions until the end, I will be way better able to answer them. I'm not very good at being able to bounce back and forth between the chat and talking. So I'm just going to talk straight through and then I'll collect your questions at the end. And I did allow an extra half an hour or so for questions in the event we go over or I don't have enough time to get to everybody. And my contact information is also in the chat. So if you had questions that you want to follow up with me on, feel free to reach out. Okay, so trauma defined. This is based on the ICD-11, also in our diagnostic and statistical manual for clinicians. Trauma, in order to oh, can everybody make sure their mic is off? Thank you. Exposure to, so we need exposure before anything. And what exposure looks like can vary, of course. And what can also vary is if we're all exposed to the same event, some of us may walk away with some symptoms. Most of us will not. So most people recover from adverse experiences just fine, but about 10% of people will end up with some post-traumatic symptoms. The exposure or the event is typically, boy, people are still coming in, I'm sorry. It can be brief or long-lasting. It should be exceptionally threatening or catastrophic in nature, and something that would be likely to cause distress in almost anyone. That gets a little more complicated with childhood abuse because a lot of times that kind of the kind of distress that we're exposed to in childhood is normative from the perspective of the child experiencing it, so they may not perceive their environment as being particularly threatening because they've adapted to it, but later in life it becomes more clear that developmental trauma had an impact. So it doesn't always look like a car accident or something very obvious. It can be more subtle and can occur through development. And every kind of trauma has its own impact. So with that being said, I wanted to share the categories of trauma. There's the first one is a simple or small t trauma. That does not mean it's insignificant. It just means it's singular. And it's singular in that there isn't prior exposure involved. So somebody may experience a car accident or a natural disaster, but don't have any kind of childhood trauma or things that have occurred prior to that event. And it's sort of like, I kind of think of it like infrastructure of any kind. The foundation is going to affect the way the rest of the structure responds. And if we have prior trauma in our infrastructure, the way our house is designed is going to affect the way we respond to things that we bring into the house. So small t trauma is just something, it's sort of a cross section. It happens once and there's not other complicating factors. Complex trauma tends to affect personality and is in response to chronic exposure, typically throughout development, or it can be throughout adulthood too, where you have multiple experiences of trauma. Developmental trauma is repeated exposure to adverse circumstances throughout development. Which ends up shaping personality and influences the way in which we perceive safety, either in people, in ourselves, or the world around us. Sexual abuse or assault, trauma that occurs in the context or in the form of sexual violence or abuse. And it can, again, occur over extended periods of time or be a singular event. Gender-based violence, violence directed at a person based solely on their gender expression or gender assigned at birth. Systemic oppression and cultural trauma, these can be used interchangeably. Systemic oppression, cultural trauma, racial and ethnic trauma, forced migration. And make sure your mics are off. I hear an echo. Displacement, weathering due to conscious or unconscious bias, microaggressions, etc. And this is integrated into day-to-day language and behavior and definitely takes a toll. And then, of course, there's large-scale trauma, natural disasters, high conflict areas, community-based trauma, and genocide. So why does the type of injury matter? It will influence the way in which any given person responds, particularly when we account for prior experiences. So why trauma coaching? I touched upon this a little bit in the beginning, but the global disease burden of trauma is very significant, and post-COVID is even, of course, more significant. So 18 to 36% of people, that's the percentage of the global disease burden. That's pretty significant. And there are all kinds of other consequences associated with trauma based on, I don't know how many of you have heard about the ACEs study that was done that looked at, how much adversity we experience in childhood will have a really significant effect on our overarching health. So chronic disease is strongly correlated with childhood adversity. So we have this impetus to do something. The hope with trauma is while it has a lot of consequences, it's mostly preventable, right? Like most interpersonal trauma doesn't need to happen. I keep getting distracted by people wanting to join. So we can do a lot to prevent it. We can do a lot to support survivors, and we can do a lot to treat it. We have lots of fancy treatment modalities available, but gosh darn it, most of the world does not have access to them and cannot afford them. Here I list other consequences of trauma, including the number of years connected to disability due to mental health conditions has increased up to 16% between 2005 and 2013. I couldn't find the statistics for post-COVID, ironically. So if anyone knows, I would love to hear what those numbers are, but I couldn't find them. I suspect they're significantly higher. In 17 countries, only 20% of those who had met criteria for a psychiatric diagnosis or condition received care for their condition, with low and middle income countries, of course, carrying the largest burden here. And then another thing to consider is that we're learning more about epigenetics in that we all have sort of a light switch, right? A PTSD light switch. And if our family members were exposed before, and then our children are born, that light switch is flipped on when they're exposed to adverse events. And then, of course, PTSD affects how we interact with other people, and then trauma can become self-perpetuating. So intervention, from my mind, is it's urgent. It has urgency to it, given all of the complexities of the world that we live in today. And then, of course, as I mentioned, PTSD and chronic disease, there's such a strong and robust research base that establishes that trauma really affects our overall health. And we can prevent those diseases by preventing trauma or treating trauma or supporting people with trauma. So again, just the global gap in care is huge. In one study of 17 countries that I referenced in the last slide, low and middle income countries carry the largest burden and gaps in care. The World Health Organization estimates that over 1 million mental health workers are needed to meet the growing demand. Over half of the population will experience a trauma in their lifetime. As I mentioned, only 10% of those will walk away with PTSD. And almost 9%, there's an almost 9% lifetime prevalence of PTSD. So I, again, conceptualize coaching as a form of task shifting, which is recommended by the World Health Organization. And that organization started studying this and becoming an advocate for it around 2000. And there's plenty of research that supports it as an intervention that really expands access to care, all kinds of care. All the various forms of healthcare are expanded when we utilize paraprofessionals and pre-professionals, and not just those with advanced degrees, because there just aren't enough people in the world with those kinds of degrees to meet the need. So examples are community health workers. I've been to Rwanda many times. I have a lot of colleagues there. And one of the major interventions that they have employed following genocide in 1994 was using community health workers. And those are people who reside in both rural and urban communities, who are connected to the citizens of those communities and are trusted by the citizens of those communities. They are not people with advanced degrees. Some of them may or may not have completed their full education. They have a desire to help and the capacity to do so, and therefore receive training to administer certain components of healthcare, which relieves the burden, some of the burden of the tasks from those with the advanced degrees, which frees them up to serve more people. Other examples are peer supports, again, very well established as safe and effective in the literature. Friendship benches in Zimbabwe, mental health ambassadors in Ghana, and other medical providers have support staff. So as a therapist, I would love to have, a therapist assistant. That does not exist, and I think it should, but every other kind of healthcare provider has someone to support them, and we have trainings to get them into those roles. So expanding the highly educated workforce to meet demand is not possible. And I make all of these arguments because I want to establish that I'm, number one, coming from a research-based perspective. Number two, I know that some people get their feathers ruffled when we talk about coaches because there are concerns around scope of practice and safety, which I think are legitimate. So I want to acknowledge both sides and talk about both sides. But also, just as someone who's worked with trauma, and you watch people suffer for so long because they don't have access to adequate care or treatment, I do feel like it is an urgent issue. And it's arguably not ethical for us to do nothing. So coaching and the research, I mentioned a couple of things here, but I also, at the end of the training, I have a list of a bunch of other articles that are available on Google Scholar. I'm not allowed to distribute myself, but I can tell you what's out there, and you can go find them and read them on your own. So there's more studies that I reference at the end of the training if you're interested on reading more. But here are a couple of examples. There's one case study on coaching and dissociative identity disorder. That's one of my specialties. And that DID is very complex and requires a lot of specialized training for treatment. This particular case study went very well. The subject was able to delineate what the coach does and what the therapist does, and was able to utilize their treatment team very effectively, to the extent that their overarching care or trajectory of care was less, which for this particular population means a lot, because the average length of treatment for somebody with DID is 7 years. And it's typically 7 years before somebody even gets the diagnosis correct. So it's a long time to struggle. I do hear somebody with their mic on, so please turn it off. For borderline personality disorder, a very common intervention is dialectical behavior therapy, and the coaching component of DBT has found to be as effective or more effective than the therapy. With both of these two top studies, the case study and DBT especially, though, lower attrition, greater reduction in symptoms, and higher overall satisfaction due to the amount of support that clients are receiving through the coaching. Because, weekly therapy has become the model, but there's not a lot of research that says that's the way to go. It's just sort of an assumption at this point. But, I've known in working with my clients, if I do some trauma work with them, it's pretty disruptive, and having some extra support in between is helpful. Also, if I can do biweekly work and have a coach supporting in between therapy appointments, I've opened up myself to see more clients, therefore expanding the base of clients I can serve. So that's kind of my way of thinking of it. Another study on eating disorders and coaching, 40% of those receiving coaching experienced a reduction in urges to engage in eating disorder behaviors. And so far, no study to date has shown harm to those who've received coaching supports, and all but one study showed benefits. So my argument is more therapy is not the answer, innovation is. And this may not be the right innovation for everybody, but it's what I came up with. Okay, so moving into the nuts and bolts of ethics and trauma coaching. So the first piece is informed consent. This is something that is important with therapy, or any time we're engaging in something where we're entrusting another person with our health and well-being. We need to know what we're getting ourselves into. For coaches, clients, this first line is supposed to say coaches. Coaches must inform clients, first of all, of both the benefits and potential risks associated with coaching. And I would argue this should be in a form, but it should also be a conversation. So we give opportunity for questions and to talk about the limits and parameters of what you're offering. They should be informed that the coach may end the relationship the client can end the relationship without any consequence to them, other than no longer receiving services. So clients obviously will not be punished if they don't receive care, or if they decide to leave the relationship. They should be informed of the parameters and limitations of the coaching relationships. And it's very important that, with trauma survivors specifically, we want to know and be very clear what the parameters of any relationship is. And we want to be consistent in maintaining those parameters. It can be very tempting to be flexible, and that is a nuanced part of a relationship with somebody who's working through trauma, that we have to find the balance between being flexible and adaptive, but also predictable. So maintaining those boundaries and being very clear about what they are, or I should say parameters, that's a better word, I think, and limitations of the coaching relationship. The more clear it is from the get-go, the better you are, the better the relationship is set up to serve the client and be effective and safe. Clients should be made aware of any risks associated with coaching, especially if it's remotely, but also, of course, in person. They must explicitly agree to services, usually in the form of a signature. In some parts of the world, signatures aren't possible, so you have to adapt to wherever you are in terms of how agreements are made. We want to be very clear about what the role of a therapist is versus a role of a coach, and be very clear about when we might refer somebody to a therapist in the event that we've identified the fact that they might be outside of our scope. And we will get into scope of practice specifically and what the roles of each are in a little bit. A client should have clarity regarding, oh, I just said that, I'm sorry. And then informed consent must be conveyed in clear, easy to understand language. So legal lingo is not, where we're just kind of crossing our T's and dotting our I's without taking into consideration that there's a human in front of us. We want to make sure that our language is easy to understand. Some say 6th grade level. In the US, it's about what we want our forms to
The
be.
bed's ready if you want to take a quick demo. The bed is ready. Yeah.
Somebody's mic is on. Let me check and see who that is real quick. Sorry, a second.
I think they turned it off.
Okay. Indiana, your phone, let me see if I can. Indiana, please turn on your camera, and also your mic is on. Okay, so let's keep going. I'll keep my eye on that. Okay, so the next piece is relationships and conflict of interest. I actually want to hold on a second. Okay, relationships and conflicts of interest. It's really important that we're clear what our role is. And also, a lot of people don't have their cameras on. Please turn them back on. Thank you. We want to be really clear about what our role is and what it is not, and what the boundaries are. So we don't want to have more than one relationship with our client. That's confusing. So if you're a coach, that's all you are. And in social work, the rule is that if you have a relationship with somebody as a therapist, you have to wait 2 years to have any other kind of relationship with that person. I personally say once a client, always a client. And so I never have any kind of a friendship or any kind of relationship with my clients at any point in my life. So I'm pretty clear about that personally. Of course, sexual relationships are completely inappropriate and not endorsed by Orenda coaching. I would consider it an exploitation of the client. Personal relationships blur the lines and again are not appropriate. Because coaching is not a regulated industry, of course you could choose to have a personal relationship with your client. I would deem it inappropriate, and it poses risk to clients. We don't want to discriminate against our clients based on age, gender, race, socioeconomic status, or any other demographic variable. We must actively pursue justice, and part of justice is having accessibility to services, including ours. And we should be actively rebuking racism, sexism, or any other kind of cultural abuses. Because as coaches, we don't only want to support those who have experienced adversity, but we want to prevent it as well. So we're warriors too. Gifts, giving or accepting gifts, I would deem inappropriate, with the exception of those that are culturally relevant or are of minimal fiscal value, like $5 or less in the US. Conflicts of interest. Coaches should be aware of potential conflicts of interest and must avoid intentionally exploiting others for gain of any kind. If a conflict of interest is discovered, I would talk to the client about it and then refer to another coach. And then boundaries or parameters. We want to, again, be clear and consistent about our professional boundaries and apply them to all of our clients equally. That can get, I mean, that seems obvious, but when it gets tricky is when we offer a sliding scale, for example. So how are we going to decide who gets that and who doesn't? You know, sometimes a story is compelling to us, and that might tempt us to offer a sliding scale based on the story. So is it stories? Is that how we decide, or what? So however I would create, if you're going to offer sliding scale as a coach, I would have some guidelines for how you make those decisions so that you're certain yourself and you're holding yourself accountable. You know that you're applying those boundaries, or I'm sorry, like your generosity is being shared or applied equally. Okay, next slide. Cultural competence and humility. We need to encourage and model cultural awareness and humility when we're working with those who are coming from a different cultural origin than we are. And getting training and education, if we're working with someone outside of our norm, is really important to being able to serve them well. We don't want our clients to be our teachers. We want them to be our, you know, we're walking alongside them and in their journey. So we don't want to place anything on them that is additional. You know, it's not fair. Coaching is intended to build capacity and providing mental health support on a global scale. So having awareness of that fact, my particular coaching program was designed with the world in mind. And I want it to be able to be adapted. And so it can be applied to a variety of cultures. So if it's being used in another culture, it has to be adapted to that culture. Somebody has their mic on. Orenda strongly encourages the lifelong pursuit of training and education in the areas of unconscious bias, cultural competence, and humility. Okay, privacy and confidentiality. We want to be certain that we maintain the privacy and confidentiality of our clients. Again, there are no laws around this, but it is the right thing to do, and it creates safety, a foundation of safety for our clients. So having clarity around how you're going to protect the identity of your clients and also their story, and sharing that with your client should be part of your informed consent. We want to keep their identifying information private, and this is true in case consultations, etc. So when I do a case consult, for example, I mix up everything. I never present on an actual client. I pull pieces of stories that I know, and then that's how I present when I'm doing a case presentation, or if I'm asking you for a consultation. I don't say anything about the identity of the client because oftentimes that's unnecessary or irrelevant. So, but I might talk about what they're struggling with that I need help with. Do not reveal the identity of clients without explicit written consent and clear communication. And I do encourage coaches to communicate with other providers, just like, you know, I talk to the doctors and other people on the care team with all of my clients. So we're all on the same page. It's really important. And I would hope that coaches would do the same thing. But doing so means that we have to share with our client that we've done that, and we get their permission to do so. And again, we make efforts to protect their own privacy. Somebody's mic is on. Let me check and see if I can find it again. Okay. So moving on, private conduct and self-care. So we, as coaches, are also models of our community, and therefore we don't want to engage in harmful behaviors. We want to make sure, I always argue this with my clinicians too, that it's our ethical duty to ensure that we have longevity in the work that we're doing. And the only way we can do that is to take care of ourselves. And self-care goes beyond bubble baths, as we all know. It's a unique sort of formula that that you come up with on your own, but it is our own responsibility to ensure that we're cared for. There's a book called Trauma Stewardship that I strongly encourage you to read, and it's the text that I use for the course that talks a lot about how to take care of yourself, even in the context of doing hard work. Just a moment, I'm going to try and take care of that. Okay, sorry everybody, one moment. At least I don't have the full 100 people. This would take a lot longer. I've got one more person that I need to mute. One moment. Okay. It's the responsibility of the coach to ensure their physical and emotional health in order to be able to provide quality care to their clients and to be predictable. Coaches who are impaired in such a way that may cause harm to their clients should, again, assume responsibility for their own health and well-being. And should a coach become professionally impaired, it's their duty to make referrals to other coaches prior to terminating services for the client whenever possible. Scope of practice. So this is usually where the topic of coaching gets kind of spicy sometimes. But being really clear about what a coach can do and coach cannot do is so helpful both to the client, but also to the industry. So first of all, hopefully we all know coaching is not therapy. Practicing therapy is considered outside of the coach's scope and will cause harm to our clients. The role of a coach is to provide skill building. You can provide bridge coaching sessions between therapy sessions, and we focus on the present and the future while the therapist can focus on the past. We do not process or focus on past trauma, and we do not utilize any skills that therapists are trained in, like EMDR, cognitive behavior therapy, etc. CBT does have some coaching components, and I believe there are some coaching trainings that are CBT focused, but in and of itself, it's something that typically mental health providers are trained in. We want to recognize that processing trauma can be overwhelming and can pose a dire threat to the health and safety of the client outside of therapy. So when we start to get into those stories, we are dysregulating our client. I think of it like emotional surgery, that we're going in, we're cleaning out a wound, and we want to give our clients the capacity to plan for the disruption in their life. And the coach can be the person that supports during that disruptive period, but the disruption in processing past trauma should happen in the context of therapy only because of the kind of threat it can pose to the safety of the client. And again, we want to be clear about the parameters of coaching and the relationship from the very beginning. And I even argue that before your client even talks to you, they should know what you do and don't do. So on your website, in your electronic communications, etc., it should be very evident before any contact is made. And just to delineate, make really clear what a coach does and what a therapist does. So first of all, therapists can diagnose, assess, treat mental health conditions. Coaches cannot do that. They can process trauma. They can be oriented to the past, present, and future, although we can delegate some of our work to coaches as related to the present and the future. Therapists can work with the trauma story and utilize specific modalities that they've been trained in. Therapy in the West is rooted in the medical model, what's wrong with you orientation. And, those are legitimate questions. What's wrong? We want to know what's wrong so we can help people feel better, but that is distinctive from coaching, which I'll talk a little bit more about. So coaching is typically rooted in positive psychology, and I also employ post-traumatic growth theory to my course, and that is the assumption that adversity does often result in growth in people. the research tends to support the idea that that's more likely to happen in the context of a supportive community or healthy relationships. So there's that piece, but I do believe that most people have the capacity to grow and you know, have some pain to purpose in their lives. But positive psychology and coaching is often rooted in positive psychology. And one piece of that is self-determination, you know, so I'm able to decide what my goals are and what the overarching outcomes of my work with any given provider is going to be. I'm accountable for my part of the growth, and my coach is accountable for their role. There's a lot of measurement that goes into coaching. Hopefully there's measurement that goes into therapy too. It is nice to see data so you can see what's working and what's not. We don't want to just engage in some sort of self-fulfilling idea that we're doing good work when we don't really know if we're doing good work or not. Coaching is typically strengths-based, solution-focused, and typically short-term. I didn't have that in there, but often it is a short-term relationship. It's present and future-oriented. We don't engage with the trauma story, and that should be part of your informed consent, that the trauma narrative itself is where pathology can reside sometimes. That's where symptoms come up, and we need to have a plan for treatment for the trauma and the symptoms. And if we engage in the story, but we are not trained in how to contain the symptoms and the results of working through the story, then we have the potential to hurt our clients and do harm. And I view coaches as skills specialists. So we're working on the things like, you know, a lot of people with PTSD or trauma symptoms have difficulty sleeping. And difficulty sleeping causes other difficulties around health and makes it hard to manage our emotions. And our emotions, when we have trauma, are already difficult to manage. So sleep is one of the first things that I go to help regulate with my clients. And some of that might be, you might help them come up with a routine. You might help them evaluate their daytime activities to see how they might be affecting nighttime. And then also, you know, have some skills around managing nightmares. If a nightmare comes up, maybe you have a sleep journal or something like that. You know, these are skills that can help with sleep. We might also look at diet and exercise and see if there are some interventions that we could support our clients in engaging in to improve sleep and mood as well. There are a lot of skills to be built around managing emotion, especially if somebody comes from a history that's complicated throughout development. Emotion regulation is not going to be a skill that comes by easily if the caregiving context was, you know, chaotic, unpredictable, etc. So we can work on helping manage emotion. Those are some examples of the skills that coaches can work on. And not all of them. Is by no means exhaustive. So as I mentioned earlier, self-determination, approaching coaching through this lens is an ethical orientation to supporting people who have had their power taken away by another event, another person or persons, etc. So we want to empower our clients to make their own choices and to have ownership over them. We want to be aware of unconscious bias, as I mentioned, that interferes with the promotion of self-determination and personal empowerment. We do not want to engage in enabling behaviors with clients or the communities that we're interacting with. We want to assume that all people are capable of growth, change, etc. And then we can find, you know, the areas where there is room for growth or skill building, but we do assume that all people are capable. All coaches understand that engagement in services is voluntary, and the goals set are reflective of what the client wants and what the client's values. So our value set may not match, but that's okay. We're honoring theirs, not ours. And our personal values must not interfere with the self-determination of the client. Client abandonment and abuse. So, you know, the abuse part is kind of easy. Like, we're here because we don't want to hurt people. We want to help people. So most of the time it's easy to say, you know, we don't want to hurt people. through exploitation, engaging in a romantic relationship, etc. We are in a position of power, so it's important that we acknowledge that and that we do not exploit it in any way. And that can also apply to financial exploitation, meaning if, let's say, for example, a client is continuing the coaching relationship, but you believe that they've met their goals. They don't need you anymore. And increasing visits beyond what is necessary is a form of financial exploitation. So being really clear with the client, and that's where data can help you too, or you and the client have agreed on these goals, they've met the goals. So unless there are evolution in the goals, it might be time to terminate. And there's a lot of beautiful work that goes into the ending as well. But we do not want to abandon our clients. And this can come in a lot of forms that are subtle, but also obvious. The most obvious is ending the relationship suddenly, without reason, without collaboration, and without a plan for continuation. And it's also really nice if you're working with survivors that you have a backup coach that you can refer to in the event that you are incapacitated in some way, you know. So we want to make sure our clients have the opportunity for support in the event that we can't support them. Abandonment, in the moment of a traumatic event, we all feel alone, you know, most of the time. We feel like there's no foundation underneath of our feet and we've already been left. That can be compounded by dismissal or minimization of a response to the event or to the event itself. It can come in the form of not doing something that should have been done at the time of trauma. It can come in the form of leaving, you know, that's the most obvious, but there are a lot of subtleties around abandonment, and it can happen in a variety of ways that aren't quite as obvious. But the harm that abandonment causes a trauma survivor is so profound. And then if you've done that, then you've contributed to their suffering. And obviously, I'm assuming everyone here does not want to do that. So being very thoughtful about endings, but also how you engage and acknowledge are ways to avoid abandonment with our clients. And you want to be really skillful at healthy interactions, including conflict resolution. You know, all healthy relationships also have conflict. Conflict is normal. We need to be able to work through it. And once we've done that with our clients, it solidifies the relationship even further. So avoiding conflict is not a goal, but working through it healthily with our clients is a goal. And we want to be good at that. Again, clear and consistent parameters about the relationship. I would say contracts protect relationships, clear and consistent parameters protect relationships. So doing all of that up front helps set the stage for the whole thing. If there's a poor coach-client fit, that's a hard conversation to have, and doing it ethically is you have to have skill around that. The coach may feel you're a bad fit. You may feel the client's a poor fit. Either way, we want to have a conversation with the client about why, collaborate with the other providers, and have a really kind, well thought out plan and strategy for referring your client to another provider. Again, any kind of abuse is obviously unacceptable. Engaging in a romantic relationship or personal relationship with your client is an exploitation of the power dynamic, I would argue. And again, financial exploitation can include continuing the coaching relationship beyond its use. So I unbelievably squeezed that into 45 minutes. Here's my contact information, and also here are references for gosh, it's Friday. I reference these articles throughout the training, and then there are additional articles and book chapters. If you want a copy of this training, go ahead and let me know via email, and I'll send you one. And I can open it up for questions now. I'll check the chat, but for now, go ahead and take your, oh, please show slide 20 again, no problem. So feel free to ask me questions, and I'm also going to look at the chat. Awesome. Oh, go ahead.
You mentioned that there is a free Trauma 101 training. Could you put the link for that in the chat again?
Yes. Let me go up to the top and find it really quickly.
Thank you.
Here it is. Some of these I'm a little clunky with technology, so it takes me a second. There you go. Thank you, Gwen. Well, Gwen left. Okay. Any other questions before I go through the chat? There are good questions in here. Okay. Brianna asked, are there legal bindings and ethics for coaches? My understanding is no, not yet. However, I'm a proponent of that. So I hope that we can advocate for legislation where there are legal bindings, and no, we do not have to answer to any regulatory state board at this point. So again, I am an advocate for both of those things, but they do not exist right now. Brianna, higher degree is valid. They have professional training, time, research theories, and education. Coaches may have some of that and be trauma informed. Sure, but not the same. Yep, you're exactly right. They are different. Oh, there's a little bit of a debate in here, which I'm not going to engage in those. You two can hash it out a little later.
Would it be okay if I just want to thank you for this presentation? And I just want to clarify that my comment was just about being curious of experiences with therapists who are, master's level, but are not trauma informed, like you're describing. And that's the only thing that I wanted to.
Oh, yeah. Okay. So your question is, can you just give me your whole question? I can answer it.
Just your thoughts about how to also be aware of when the therapist may not be helping a client in ways that are sensitive. For example, I've seen a real focus on, CBT, when really in my coaching work, it was really clear that the client was, dysregulated and might benefit from something different. And I'm just curious about your thoughts around that, where sometimes I've experienced that as coaches, I, in my work, are more trained in development and can see the signs of trauma faster than some therapists. So just some thoughts around that. But thank you so much for sharing today. It was really helpful.
Oh yeah, thank you for coming. Well, I would say that, therapists, there are so many areas of specialty. As a trauma therapist, I'm thinking, why aren't we all like, isn't trauma at the root of everything? But I try and be. There is this movement for trauma-informed practices to permeate everything, education, and various sectors of the economy. That trauma-informed work it just is a higher level of interaction and awareness, and emotional intelligence that we're asking of all of ourselves. So there's that as a baseline and a foundation, which is a great thing. And at the same time, like when I was in grad school, there was one class on trauma. The majority of my postgraduate of my training came after I graduated with my master's degree. So I think that remains true for a lot of master's level programs, and a lot of them also have their own subspecialty, which may or may not be around trauma. So I don't think every therapist is ever going to be, perfect for the client. And in that case, then I support the client in finding the right fit but also being forgiving of the fact of the client that the therapist may not have that kind of training. but I don't know if that answers your question or not, does it?
It does.
Okay.
There's a feeling of let's defer to therapists because they're helpful, and when I'm noticing that they're not being helpful, it's a good conversation to
Yeah, it's a good
have.
conversation.
Yeah.
It has to be delicate though too, because we
Very.
don't want to
Yes.
split our client from their providers, or we don't want them to split us between each other
Absolutely.
too.
I'm with you as
Yeah.
well. But that was really helpful. Just giving that context that you gave was super helpful. Thank you.
Oh, great. Yeah, no problem. I see a question here. I'm wanting to integrate peers with DBT, but this would mean teaching them skills. I created worksheets to help peers that were based on DBT skills. Is there anything you feel I need to track alongside their progress? Well, I mean, DBT is one of those orientations that are one of those modalities that master's level clinicians are trained in. So coaches want to be careful with that, but based on this, with the coaching component of DBT, the main things that are being regulated surround emotion regulation, mindfulness-based skills, and interpersonal skills. So I like measuring those things and helping the client define how they individually would know that they're successful. So for example, let's say, anger and irritability is a common symptom of trauma. And so it might show up in yelling at our partners, and that yelling might occur a couple times a week. So I might be measuring the frequency of, losing our temper around those we love and see if that goes down. But basically I like to know what the categories of disruption are for people with trauma, emotion regulation, sleep difficulties, and mood. Those 3 categories are the categories I'm going to focus on in terms of skills, and then I would measure them. But in terms of, you have to individualize it per client and based on how it's manifesting in their day-to-day life. So I can't give too concrete of an example, but I might be able to if you ask me a direct question, about a client. Aw, thank you, Brianna. It's nice. Marianne said, thank you. Do you think it would ever be appropriate to coordinate with a client's therapist in any way, say in the case that your services are being used in part as bridge sessions, or does that blur the lines too much? No, I strongly encourage collaborating care with a therapist, especially if you're providing, Vanna, I see, or Jill, I see your hand raised. You can chime in just a second. But that's just so helpful. And in fact, the way that I did it with my coaches and my clients is that, hey, I talked to my client, we had a pretty rough, that was hard. We do some hard work, some difficult trauma work. Client's dysregulated, needing a little extra support. I asked the client, do you want me to contact? Oh, you're so welcome, Oscar. Do you want me to contact a coach? I even facilitated getting this appointment set up because I could. It was easy because they're part of my organization. But and then I would reach out to the coach, update them on what happened and why what the client is needing based on the work that we had done. And then the bridge appointment would happen. Or sometimes my clients would be struggling for other reasons, either external or related to the therapy. And then I might facilitate a bridge session under those circumstances. So I hope that's clear. And Jill, you can go ahead and take your mic off and ask your question if you'd like.
I was just wondering if, in so many instances, getting the person to agree to any sort of therapy is the roadblock. So do you see a way how this coaching would be able to assist in getting that? Or, that's, still like my number one roadblock that I see, especially for so many families of those with serious mental illness. And but I really like this idea. So how do you see it as perhaps being able to assist in getting someone to agree to therapy?
Well, that's a really good question. I'm so glad you asked it, actually. I kind of think of coaching, it can be the gateway to therapy, like
Yeah.
there are people that can't afford it or are afraid of it. And it's hard, therapy is really difficult. I personally do not like it. So it's just because it's so disruptive. So I understand why people avoid that work, and sometimes looking at the past means you have to look at, shameful things that you may have done in response to trauma or the trauma itself. There's a lot of shame that's intermingled
Yes.
in it. So there are good reasons for avoiding therapy. But if you can experience a person who knows you well and accepts you, without knowing the ins and outs of the story, but still you're creating this experience of acceptance and safety, and opening yourself up to learning, which is a vulnerability in and of itself. That is a foundational experience that can support movement towards therapy. But one thing I do we don't want to be so, we don't want to enable our clients to avoid doing the work. That's the only caveat, that if our clients are so dysregulated and disrupted by their symptoms that we cannot adequately coach them and provide our services effectively, then sometimes the relationship needs to be contingent upon that. But that, of course, is assuming the client has access, and that there are some concerns around, engaging that are rooted in fear that you can help them address. But the short answer is yes, absolutely. I think that coaching is a great gateway. Thank you, Alexa. And you enjoy your weekend too. So hopefully that answered your question, did it?
Yes, it's really given me some ideas, and your whole presentation has spurred me to look into more. I love all the resources you provided. Thanks.
Oh, thank you. I'm so glad. Well, does anybody else have any questions? Well, it seems like a no. Thank you all so much again for coming today, and I hope that it was helpful. Again, feel free to email me if you would like a copy of the PowerPoint, and I will send it to you happily. And be well and have a great weekend.
Thank you.
Thank you.